welcome. And we're very happy to have Monika Bielskyte here, futurist. And we're also equally happy to have Sofia Ulver, associate professor in marketing at LUSEM. And we're about to talk about the future. And I've heard you before, and you mentioned something about futurist literacy. Could we start off there, please? Could you explain it to me?
Yeah, so futurist literacy, I think, is becoming a more popular term. And it's really about having a capacity to grasp, to make sense of what is shaping the future and what could be the possible future avenues. Of course, for people that are working in the field, actual working futurists, foresight practitioners, and adjacent fields, we have to have sort of a much more in-depth knowledge. But I think futurist literacy is becoming a really, really urgent field to expand and to render more accessible to people across age groups and across the disciplines. It needs it needs to be educated, I think, from the primary school to high school, but also especially for people within the older age groups.
Just give me an example of what I should look into to increase my futurist literacy.
Well, futurist literacy is really, again, about understanding what is shaping the world. So having basic understanding of technological innovation, of social, political, cultural emergent changes, and how all of it affects each other. I think there's no futurist literacy without historical literacy and present-day literacy. The fact that we currently do not have even foundational futurist literacy is leading to people starting to very easily believe all kinds of conspiracy theories. I mean, there's conspiracy theories about the Great Reset. That World Economic Forum came up with this idea that we should use this pandemic moment and the kind of changes that needed to be implemented to maybe reconsider larger changes that society needs. And all of a sudden, people made into a grand conspiracy theory. Right now, there's a conversation around 15-minute cities and walkable cities that, is a very interesting idea, but also problematic and how that could exclude some disabled people. But because there was total lack of understanding of those issues, people started thinking how that also is some kind of crazy conspiracy. Because people do not have basic historical literacy of history of medicine, history of vaccines, basic biological knowledge on what viruses are, how viral diseases work, what is the history of the pandemics. People ended up believing things such as, 5G is creating a virus, which, if you'd have, the bare minimum of that knowledge, you would understand that if 5G could create a virus, we could truly have some magical technologies. Now, that is not the case if you have even bare minimum of the building blocks that could help you reckon with the future. So I think, the term is still quite sort of open, but it essentially means having foundational knowledge that could allow you to analyze information that is coming about the future and distinguish conspiracies from more factual information, distinguish sort of inflammatory, hype-based headlines versus what is actually happening in those fields. And of course, for people to whom that is not a full-time job, the degree of depth that you can have with it is very different than the professionals. But I think all of us really need to have bare minimum foundations, or we will succumb to disinformation warfare, to hybrid warfare, and to media manipulation that could lead to not just really harmful thinking, but also really harmful behavior.
I mean, we all have some kind of relation to the future or have some kind of thinking to it. For me, it's talking about my kids, about their future choices for high school, say, or what do you want to be when you grow up? How do I go about that in implementing or adding some kind of a bigger sense of what does the future entail for you? I mean, education, job, environmental instabilities, climate change, stuff like that. But is there a way I can inspire my kid to be a more future-minded, future-literate person?
Yeah, so a huge aspect of my work is really analyzing how science fiction narratives that are often stuck in the scientific worldview that predates 21st century, meaning an outdated scientific understanding. It was the best available science back then, but since then we have evolved a lot. Yet science fiction narratives that are stuck within that understanding continue perpetuating what we consider futuristic or unfuturistic in the present day moment. And so I think it's really, really important for us to start analyzing the actual happenings within all of the fields of innovation, not just technological innovation, but also scientific research, but also infrastructural innovation, design innovation, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of just allowing our imagination to be biased on these sort of popular sci-fi narratives that are very disconnected from reality. They might seem futuristic, but really are not.
My experience is that they're usually either feudal or like Roman Republic-ish.
Well, again, and that is a problem. Like science fiction, and one of the most prominent science fiction authors, Ursula Le Guin, said that it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But so it was for people that thought the divine rule of kings is inevitable. So what I think is really frustrating with so much of mainstream sci-fi, especially the kind of sci-fi that reaches millions, hundreds of millions of people in the popular format of TV series and science fiction movies, is that it imagines these magical technologies, intergalactic space drive and conscious AI and, whatnot. And yet it cannot imagine a society that is not misogynist, that is not ableist, that is not homophobic, that is not xenophobic, that is not racist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we need to understand is that innovation is not about technological capacities. It's not about the tech specs. It is really about the impact. What is the impact on us as the inhabitants of this planet? What is the impact on all of the other species and on the planetary body itself? And we need to start judging innovation in that way. Which then again brings us to this realization that just because we can do something, maybe it's not what we should be doing. Just because science fiction led us to believe that this is a very exciting thing, maybe this is not where we should be putting all of our priorities. Because in the present day, we have mapped better the outer space than the ocean floor. We have spent more time theorizing what would be alien life forms than actually analyzing what are the life forms that we are least familiar with, such as extremophiles, with the biological entities living in the depths of our ocean, in the depths of our soil, et cetera, et cetera. And yet these are all life forms that could give us so many answers for the complex issues that we're facing today. I realized I didn't really fully answer your question, how to make your kid more excited about it. I mean, I think our education system is really broken. It doesn't gear us up for futures literacy because we're looking so much into history as sequence of events, and especially in the fairly distant past. We are not looking into the history of the world and the history of us as evolution of ideas, belief systems, and not just actions, but how ideas have had impact. And I think telling these narratives in that way is much more compelling because it's not just some kind of dates that you need to memorize. It invites your actual reasoning and understanding of actions and consequences and motivations behind, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also really need to teach much more, and again, not just young people, but also adults and especially the elderly, much more recent history, geopolitical history post Second World War, all the way to the present day, the history of medicine, the history of science, the history of technology. Because what happens today is that, yes, there has been incredible discriminatory bias within the history of medicine, within the history of technology. But because people are so unfamiliar with it, whenever they learn any small fact of it, they're like, oh, you see, this is all some kind of grand conspiracy, because this was all designed around harmful systems. And it seems just so surprising, rather than, yes, that is part of history and we need to acknowledge it. And by acknowledging that, maybe we start learning how to not perpetuate it.
Is that a way of looking at things as, well, a system that we see as inherently bad or evil, they will do bad and evil things, but we cannot really internalize systems that we perceive as kind, good, our friends, actually being perpetrators of mean stuff in history, say?
Oh, 100%. I mean, unfortunately, we humans tend towards oversimplification across the field. I mean, we long for simple explanations that say that we are the goodies and our in-group are the goodies and all those others are the baddies. We really struggle to reckon with complexity that our team and we ourselves willingly or sometimes completely unconsciously have participated in creation or perpetuation of harm. And we struggle to understand that whoever that we have identified as baddies could have also had good points. So our own involvement in harm is something that we always want to shed the responsibility for. And another huge thing, and I think this is why we are ending up in real struggle to reckon with the geopolitical strife that we're experiencing in the world right now, is we tend to engage in oversimplifications that give agency to only one powerful party. And so in this example, Western centrism is being perpetuated not just by the people that are ardent believers of the Western culture, everything good in America, for people that embrace America first, make America great again, or European-centric narratives. Everything good is because of America. Everything good that exists, all the civilizational achievements exist because of the Western world. Yet at the same time, you get other people, generally more sort of on the left political spectrum, that start claiming that, well, everything bad exists because of America. Or because of the West. So behind every and any single thing, when Ukrainians protested their corrupt pro-Russian regime, and that led to revolution, which led to then greater separation from Russia, which then led into Russia's invasion. Those people explain that as, of course, those Ukrainians could not have had their own agency. Similarly, like the Baltic countries couldn't have had their own agency to want to join European Union or NATO. They were forced to do that by the West. And of course, Russia wouldn't have its own agency to invade. It was just responding. It was just provoked. And of course, a lot of the stuff that is happening in the Middle East, well, this was only just the legacy of Western colonialism, and countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia and China do not have their own agency. And so, it perpetuates these oversimplified explanations that do not actually lead towards any kind of resolution of the conflicts that we face today. It only deepens them. And so whenever we are trying to reckon with, how do we deal with the future, be it political or technological, we need to understand that multiple parties can have agencies at the same time. You need to stop saying that my glorious ends justify whatever means. We cannot embrace destructive action just because, well, the end goal is something that we find civilization aspirational. And we also cannot just be sort of wishy-washy, optimistic, or hopeful that as long as we remove that one element that we have identified as a baddie, the whole problem will be resolved. Because we have to understand that, again, there might be multiple entities benefiting from extractive, destructive, harmful situation as it is, that do not want a peaceful resolution, that do not want an equitable resolution. So yeah, oversimplifications do not help. We need to reckon with complexity, and yet we need to find a way to communicate that in accessible language.
So Monika, one of my favorite parts of your speeches, actually, I've seen quite a lot of them, is your focus on something that you know a lot about, but that the rest of the world basically just feel the lure from. Mm-hmm. And to me, it is one of the most dangerous hegemonic ideologies that we see in this world today. And it's skewing our possibility to see a future which is livable. And that's the TESCREAL, as you call it. I've always called it the technotopian, heroic, tech billionaire-ish kind of celebration, whatever we want to call it. But the TESCREAL, how would you explain that in a short, briefly, and then say, how on earth are we going to get rid of that celebration?
Yeah, so TESCREAL is a term coined by Timnit Gebru and Emil P. Torres, who are colleagues, peers of mine. I have also simplified it into tech rapture. So it is essentially a neo-religious belief system, but where the God is a sort of fictionalized idea of technological transcendence. It is in the lineage of Christian ascensionism that essentially demonizes anything that indigenous cultures have treasured. So our bodily existence, other than human forms of life, the very soil of this planet and natural phenomena, and positions them as dirty, as temporary, as filthy in many cases, that need to be transcended towards a more perfect existence that will inevitably be technological. So reductible either to sort of engineered forms of life, technological forms of life, silicon or other sort of non-organic material-based forms of life, and or to zeros or ones, or maybe like sometime in the future, they think of sort of quantum computation based forms of life. Now, again, this perpetuates old school sort of religious belief systems into the future, and is built on very kind of similar tropes. Why it is both incredibly sort of absurd and sort of fantastical science fiction, but also very dangerous. Mm-hmm. It is because it is being embraced by a significant amount of people that have access to extraordinary amounts of funds, material wealth, as well as decision-making power within the world of technology, and also increasingly certain academic circles. So we cannot dismiss that as pure fantasies, because people, in fact, that are embracers and promoters of them, from Elon Musk to Mark Andreessen, are some of the wealthiest people on Earth. For me, though this ideology is fundamentally life-denying, it is all about transcending our physical bodies into the sort of abstract computational space and colonizing the entire universe. Why it is also dangerous? Because it dismisses the actual risks that we face today for what it labels as existential risks.
This sounds almost dystopic. Like this, what you describe here is like they actually want something that turns us into the Borg from Star Trek or Skynet in Terminator. This is basically the extermination of life forms and transcending into something techie. And that would be desirable for these?
Well,
where do they fit in? Are they some kind of messiahs?
They will escape to another space.
Well, they are. So there's a great lineage, right, of these futurists. I mean, transhumanism and cosmism, all of these ideologies have deep roots. I mean, cosmism began all the way in late 19th century Russia. Transhumanism was initially pioneered, as well as other eugenic-based ideologies by people like H.G. Wells and the Huxley brothers. The very earliest writings of futurism by Marinetti, who wrote the Futurist Manifesto and was one of the co-writers of the Fascist Manifesto, I mean, already had those ideas. Like I'm quoting from Marinetti's, one of Marinetti's writings. It was not exact Futurist Manifesto, but it was subsequent writing. He spoke how he was disgusted by the river Danube and its fat, libidinous, fecund fish. And he wanted to make the Danube River to run straight at 300 miles an hour. And that would be advance, and this idolizing of speed and the need to destroy anything that comes in the way of that ideology, the desire to destroy a lot of the culture that came behind. I mean, which we know communist ideologies have also embraced. Communist accelerationism has also embraced ethnic cleansing and destruction of indigenous cultures, of cultural frameworks and cultural artifacts as it came before, in favor of that accelerationist idea. So colonial projects have always been utopian for the colonizer and dystopian for the ones that were colonized. And so today we say, well, but if the universe is empty, if Mars is empty, if the moon is empty, if Alpha Centauri is empty, and we colonize all of that, well, how would that be harmful? We're not going to be destroying any other creatures. However, it's about the culture of that. Right? Right now, we almost colonized every possible corner of this planet. We exploited most of the corners of this planet. So the next goal is, what Elon Musk positions is go and colonize Mars. But to be honest, my take on it is that he is much more interested. Colonizing Mars is a popular story that he's selling onto the world. But the real story is going and mining the asteroid belt, which would magnify the fortunes of already the world's wealthiest people by extraordinary degrees of magnitude. And that's why people like Mark Andreessen in his Techno-Utopian Manifesto positions that, any problem that we face right now, that the quiet part that he doesn't say out, that was mostly created by technological frameworks. I mean, also political and cultural frameworks, but as enforced by means of technology, we will solve with more technology. I mean, we know how that has gone historically. So, I mean, it's just the same.
Like Hudson Bay Company, but interstellar.
100%. And, very important thing to understand that this is not like, well, they will let us live the way we want to live and they will just go and colonize Mars themselves. No. In a way, to make it compelling for people to render themselves more and more robotic, and to ultimately what they position as our goal to upload our entire beings into this, computer simulated matrix, which is like a sci-fi scenario. This is not a real future avenue. This technology is completely theoretical, but in a way, it makes sense to make our physical lives so unlivable that proposition would become appealing. So as long as we enjoy being in our bodies, as long as we enjoy to swim in a lake in the middle of the summer and feel the water in our body and the grass under our feet and the skin of our loved one, well, then those futures will not be appealing to us. So destruction of the living world, destruction of human-human connection, destruction of, our unruly pleasure of the body, not the all perfectly optimized pleasure of the body. I mean, like one of the most popular things right now amidst, Silicon Valley's techno billionaires is human optimization. Whilst before, they used to be, sitting at their computers, drinking Soylent and being completely removed from their bodies. Right now, they are measuring, all of the nutrients that they take in, exact amount of sleep, exact temperature of whatever. I mean, everything, exact amount of exercise that is needed to optimally perform. And so, even if we still have this existence within physical bodies, the goal is to make it so roboticized, so automated, that we might as well make ourselves into machines. And this is why, all of these utopian ideologies, both historically political utopias as well as today's techno-utopias, they hate disability. They want to eliminate disability. They hate queerness, and they want to eliminate queerness. And of course, they hate indigenous understanding of alternative view of what civilization could be.
A question about that, and the last question before we finish up. You talk about designing the system according to neurodivergence as a solution to leaving the terrestrial hegemony.
Yeah, so maybe, neurodivergence is not as much specifically as an antidote of terrestrial. I think, because we have to remember that also a lot of people that promote terrestrial framework, some of them are also neurodivergent, a very specific part of autism subspectrum that was identified, all the way back in the days of Nazi classification of disabled and neurodivergent people as an aspect of neurodivergent subspectrum that was actually productive. Right. So it's people that might have had certain behaviors of neurodivergent people, of autistic people, certain sensory issues, yet they were capable of excelling in mathematics, engineering, other fields of sciences. So they were deemed to be the productive part of neurodivergent people. What I'm thinking about when it comes to neurodivergence is really sort of applied ways of making futures better. I don't like these moral framings of making futures more compassionate, future designs of technological tools, of our public spaces, of our urban design, of even our sort of media platforms as more inclusive and more compassionate for most of us. Let me explain. So, of course, right now we are starting to realize that access needs for people that have wheelchair access, hard of hearing, hard of seeing, blind, deaf, that this is something, in order to be a humane society, we need to incorporate all that. We still think of it, unfortunately, as some kind of charity work, as some kind of niche work. And we don't realize how much of technology that actually ends up benefiting most of us is based on disability adaptation. Something that ends up trickling into lives of most of us. From email that was invented by a hard of hearing technologist who communicated with his deaf wife, and so phone was not working for them, to, of course, AI assistants, voice assistants, screen readers, audiobooks, subtitles, ability to enlarge, make the font smaller, dim or illuminate our screens, to, of course, so many of the physical assistive devices have all been designed around the needs of disability and end up benefiting so many more of us. Right? Of course, subtitles are not just something that helps deaf people. It's something that helps people who are second language speakers. Being able to dim the screen helps us when we are working late at night, not just people that have sensory sensitivities because of their neurodivergence. However, when we talk about disability adaptation, today we are still unfortunately very focused only on easily classifiable physical access needs. When I talk about neurodivergence adaptations, I'm especially interested to the adaptations as informed by people that are facing sensory issues, and especially sensory hypersensitivity, because that's something that has been my lived experience, so I can understand it the easiest, and I can speak about it in the most visceral manner. Not theoretically, but from my own lived experience. And that's related to autism, ADHD, and complex PTSD. So a lot of people that face sensory issues, they entail sensory hypersensitivity to light, to sound, to motion, to scent, to texture, to anything coming into your physical space. And so adaptations that we need is to really take into account much better what kind of textures we were producing within our clothing, within our lived environment, what kind of pressure that it produces. When we talk about light, is to have more modulable environments where we would be able to dim the lights or to illuminate them. When we talk about sound, to really consider the sound pollution in our public spaces as well as lift spaces. When we talk about scent, how we could avoid any kind of both sensory irritations as well as sort of other allergic reactions. What that means is that when we create those adaptations, we don't just make those environments more inclusive and safer for people of these specific neurodivergent needs, we also adapt them to many more other people with disabilities. So a lot of cancer patients, for whom their sensory experience doesn't come from neurodivergence, it comes from living with extreme pain and side effects of different medication, they also have very similar needs. They might have same allergic reactions to extreme fragrances, extreme fatigue, and even pain from sonic and light and motion inputs, so on and so forth. And also, that same thing happens to people that are able-bodied, but maybe they've been traveling on an international flight, from one continent, and now they're changing flights, after a red-eye 10-hour flight, and then they need to still fly, another sort of huge distance. And the fatigue and exhaustion leads to a very similar world perception that I don't need to be fatigued and exhausted to experience. So I think what's so interesting in there is to be curious of the perceptions of the world of neurodivergent people can help us to create much safer and inclusive technologies for all of us. So, myself as a futurist and futurist researcher, I was deeply involved in the field of virtual reality, augmented reality, extended reality, from the earliest days of this third wave of VR. And that really got me thinking, not of VR as just a new medium of entertainment, but really what happens when we move from 2D computational space into immersive computational space. What happens to user interface? What happens to user experience? And how, for me as a neurodivergent person, I was very reactive to any particular menus or characters popping too aggressively into my field of view, or any particular sound, coming from behind in a sort of really creepy manner that could trigger trauma that is lodged sort of within my body. Taking all that stuff into consideration, I was not even realizing that 10 years ago, I was really looking at it from my perspective as a neurodivergent person. But the questions I was asking and incentives I tried to create in the field ultimately makes computational experiences and immersive entertainment better, kinder, more compassionate, less traumatizing, less violent to everybody else. So again, it's really reconsidering how we look at disability adaptations, not as some kind of charity work that we need to be as so kind of as to adapt to this group of people that we're so unfamiliar with, but really how it's been an incredible force to develop technologies that are actually helpful to humanity versus the kind of technologies that have been precipitated into our world by the incentives of military industrial complex or surveillance complex or police state complex. in how disability adaptation is a much better incentive than military adaptation, even if unfortunately we still live in a world that cannot be magically demilitarized at this very moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming here. It's been so much more than what I thought and what I expected. Like when presented with the chance to speak to a futurist, I was thinking, yeah, I had my ideas. This is so much more than what I thought, and so much richer. And I would have liked to keep you here for another hour at least to talk about things. But
5 hours.
But you need to catch a plane as well.
Of course.
So we have to thank you all for listening in, and thank you both for coming and having this talk.